So at this moment, I finish with my presentation. And if you go to the agenda, then next, I would like to invite Mike Iarossi from Australia. Hopefully it's not that late to in Sydney. And I would like to say that Mike is one of the very active Business TRIZ users in Australia. And he also supported and joined, he also went on the advisory board of International Business TRIZ Association. And I hope, Mike, you will have more communication and interaction with us to develop IBTA.
Sure, thank you. Thanks,
Mike. Okay, please share your screen. You have everything.
Sure.
Please move ahead. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see this all right. Let's pull this up here.
Everything's perfect.
Okay, great. So I've really tried to keep this around the 15-minute mark, maybe push to 20, but I'll try to get us in for 15 because I think there's probably a fair bit here that you have seen, but also hopefully some things that you've never seen. And I think that probably the most value will actually come from answering some questions. So without further ado, what I really want to get into today is just sharing what I do sort of in my day-to-day experience as a management consultant. So I've got a background with Lean Six Sigma. I'm a TRIZ practitioner. I'm also a certified Scrum Master. So these tools I use literally daily. I've been using TRIZ integrated with other approaches for, I guess, probably close to 10 years now. So a fair bit of time. So that's kind of my background. And the real purpose of this today is to give you kind of a view of how we can go in a very short time from something like 2 weeks to around 6 weeks to go from taking that problem and actually working through the problem and the solution to getting to a working prototype. Okay. So I guess the first thing is just to set the stage with the barriers that we kind of run into in industry and in business. And again, some of you may have seen some of these. I won't go into too much detail on all these, but I just want to throw these out there because they come up quite a bit. And they're definitely things that can keep us from being successful when we work with customers to try to build solutions to their to their problems or to the services. So one is ambiguity of purpose. This one comes up so often because we get into the environment where we're decomposing a problem or working towards a solution. And then we almost find that we get sort of halfway into the creation of a solution and realize we maybe weren't solving the right thing, or there's a bit of ambiguity around what we're really hoping to accomplish. This is something that happens quite a bit. Cultural sabotage is something that comes up a lot as well, where senior executives are driven by personal self-interest, right? They have bonuses to make. The organization, if it's a for-profit organization, needs to return a profit. But at the same time, many organizations now are pushing customer first rhetoric and employee first rhetoric, but they still have to elevate the profitability of the organization. So there's a bit of kind of competing, I guess, goals on the cultural side. And then the suboptimal approach, this is what we're going to spend the most time on today. But, where you've got different types of teams sort of smashed together to get an outcome, it creates quite a bit of chaos. You might have a team that's used to using Agile. And so when you're bringing TRIZ tools into the equation, the Agile folks tend to really struggle with the thinking process. So oftentimes that creates chaos and creates kind of a protraction in our ability to get results. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then obviously the protracted feedback itself, a lot of the tools that I started working with in the beginning took maybe 2-3 months, sometimes even 6 months to get through an understanding of what the problem was and then what the solution was. But by the time you get to the end, the feedback loop is so protracted that the goalposts within the organization might have shifted or changed, right? You've got competing priorities happening all the time. And then also, as much as a lot of executives talk about creating an environment where we accept failure. Think of the lean startup, right? There's still a huge intolerance for failure, and what we often see in the consulting space, at least from what I've seen, is that even though a lot of executives will say that they are accepting of failure and that you would move through multiple iterations or multiple pivots, in actual fact, most of the time they expect you to get it right the first time. So anyway, these are just some of the things that we run into when we get into these projects. And I think this is why it's so important to get from an understanding of what we want to accomplish through problem decomposition, problem abstraction, solution abstraction, into the prototype, a working prototype, as quickly as possible, because there's all of these things competing. All right, so let's have a look here, just in terms of defining innovation. I know that text is cut off a bit there, but I'll just kind of talk to it. Basically, the main thing that I want to hone in on with how we define innovation is the level of diffusion. Many organizations, and most of you folks would know this, right? If you ask 10 people how they define innovation, you're going to get 10 different answers. The main thing that I like to use here is this idea of a spectrum. And I say to the clients, we want to land on the spectrum, right? There's a lot that can happen in terms of innovation, but the question is, how do we get on the spectrum? And so I plant a flag in the minds of the stakeholders that says, let's aim for an industry first, okay? If you're able to achieve an industry first in that main parameter value for whatever that service offering is, you've moved into the realm of innovation. Okay, there's other factors in there. Oftentimes we'll look at, like a 3x jump in the main parameter value, but ultimately we're trying to get to, as a starting point, a 3x multiplier in throughput or in revenue or in profit, which is quite huge. But anyway, just keep that in mind as we kind of look through this. We're going through that prototyping process as quickly as possible to achieve an industry first. Okay, so let's see if I can get rid of this thing. With the Scrum approach, so Agile Scrum, if you guys aren't familiar with this, I would think many of you are, but Agile is an umbrella, okay, and Scrum is one approach that sits under that umbrella. And I'm not going to take you into all of the details of Scrum, but I just want to give you enough so that you understand what it is Scrum is trying to do. Now, user stories, you may not see this in all Scrum teams, but I like the idea of user stories. So we start with that. As a customer, I want to, access my device so that I can check whatever. So you set up these user stories so that you give the developers a foundation to understand what the problem is that they're trying to build a solution for. And again, we don't dictate that to them. We let them work through that. We work through these. Number two is backlogs and prioritization. So again, we have a whole list of things that we want to create, or we want to prototype, or we want to build, and we have a process for how we create that prioritization. We use things like relative sizing and things like that. And then we get into the build, test, and learn. And this is really the building of the prototype, but the test and learn is also really important, because in a 2-week sprint, you're also incorporating a testing component so that at the end of that sprint, you're actually building a working solution. Okay. The other thing you'll see in these in the Scrum approach is daily scrums. That's just really a daily meeting where teams come together and they look at what they've produced the previous day, what blockers they sort of have, and then track their progress, maybe like on a Kanban board or something like that, to show how they're progressing to number 5, which is this product increment. And again, if you think about a 2-week sprint, sprints can be 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. But if you think about that sprint in 2 weeks, you're trying to get to the end of the 2 weeks and have something that works. Have a new application, have a new form, have a new user experience or a new environment created. Okay, so that's sort of the Scrum approach. Now, I'm going to link pretty much 3 different pathways coming into this Scrum approach, and then I'll show you how we get to the end product, which is this sort of rapid prototype. So that's the background on the Scrum approach. If I look at the 3 ways, so I'm come back up here. if I look at the three sort of paths coming in, now we can use any number of TRIZ tools to get here. The three that I really use a lot are the causal landscape diagram, function attribute analysis, and RCA+. The causal landscape diagram is number one. Now, I know most of you wouldn't have seen this unless you've been following some of my work or maybe seen some of the other presentations. The thing about the causal landscape diagram is it gives us time and space, but it also gives us the functions within an element that allows us to see an object. I don't know why that's moving. That allows us to see an object and the modification of that object. Now, I know you can't see the detail here and you're not meant to, but I'm just showing you this is one pathway leading into that sort of rapid prototyping environment. Function attribute analysis, again, this is another one. With function attribute analysis in a transactional environment, and Valerie alluded to this, this approach changes, okay? What I found is that you with a conceptual object, you actually have to build the conceptual object into the relationship itself. So what you often see is you'll see, like here, the hiring manager creates a role, and you can see there's an insufficient relationship between that role and the CRM. So what you actually find is when you're using function attribute analysis in a conceptual way or in a service environment or transactional environment, you have to change the approach slightly. But anyway, function attribute analysis is another tool that we use to get in here. The last one here, RCA+. Now you can use root conflict analysis on its own, but you can also use it with the causal landscape diagram. And again, most of you I would have expected would have seen this, but you're really pulling out the contradiction, okay? And you're still looking for the positive and negative effects that flow out of that. All right, now after we go through that whole process, we're trying to figure out what the problem is, how we decompose the problem, what are the contradictions. We move into abstraction. And again, I would expect many of you have seen and used or heard of abstraction. But when you get into abstraction, we start to get into this, go from problem abstraction to solution abstraction, right? But when we go into solution abstraction, what I found is when we're working with Scrum teams, we don't have to come up with a specific solution. The really cool thing is that when you're dealing with developers and you're dealing with solutions architects, they often don't want to be told how to solve the problem, right? They'd like to take the structure of the solution and, knowing what they know, create that solution. So while we can use inventive standards or separation principles and things like that, we create the structure of the solution and then we bring it back into the Scrum team to allow those developers to actually build the solution that we've sort of pre-thought out, okay? Now, when we start to get into this sort of Scrum environment for this last piece, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a second, the very final thing that we do is we go into something called selection and prioritization. Now, if you think back to what I said in the beginning about that protracted feedback loop, one of the challenges that we experienced early in business was that we really struggled on the business side to prioritize which features we were going to go after or which solutions we were going to go after. But if you start coming at this using, in this example, this is an abstraction, okay, of a function attribute analysis that we did. And what you've got here is you've got sections pulled out, right? So if you think about working with a developer, the developer can take specific features, okay? And we can take that as a discrete unit or working prototype or something that they're going to produce at the end of a sprint. And that's the beautiful thing about this approach is we don't have to build the whole thing, okay? Because we want to get through a 2-week sprint with something that works, okay? So that's what this selection and prioritization allows us to do. So, and I'm going to pause here in about 2 minutes to go into some questions. But now if we look at this kind of roadmap, and this is like Valerie alluded to, a lot of this roadmap takes us in this sort of linear way where we go through problem decomposition. And I would, again, do this in a sprint. So 2 weeks. What is the problem? Where is the problem happening? When is the problem happening? Broken down into super system and subsystem components, okay? All of the interactions between objects. And then there's another sprint, okay? And you might not be 100% done, you might be 80% done. But then we go into another sprint where we go into problem abstraction, solution abstraction, okay? And then we'll even look at some of the ways that we can use separation principles or inventive standards or whatever the case is. And that's another sprint. And then from there, we go into the actual build, okay? The build, again, will take about 2 weeks, and you should be producing something that works at the end of 2 weeks. Now, once you do the problem decomposition and solution abstraction, you may find that you get into the prototyping build stage and you just continue to iterate and iterate and iterate. And every 2 weeks, you're releasing a new product increment. So what you're really seeing here, and I'm going to turn it over for questions in just a second, what you're really seeing here is Agile, or really Scrum, and a handful of tools taken out of TRIZ, but more importantly, the TRIZ thinking process pulled into this transactional environment. Okay, let's have a look at some questions and see what we've got. I know I was talking fast, so here we go.
All right, thank you, Mike. Very interesting presentation, and I believe that when we are talking, we already, probably started some combinations of TRIZ and Agile in a while, a couple of years ago, but unfortunately I cannot do everything myself. So
Sure.
there is a company I also communicate with, and it's a rather well-known company, Xibia. Maybe you heard about them. They are focusing on also one of their big directions of work is focusing on Agile. And they also now applying TRIZ to not just using Agile, but they develop in Agile methodologies and also Scrum. So this is very, very perspective. I also, last year, we had some experiments with using TRIZ and Agile for physical products building.
Yes.
And I can tell you that there are some very well-known companies that already apply it. Unfortunately, they keep it as a secret. I wanted to have some publication in a TRIZ review, but in 3 cases, we get rejection. Bosses of companies, unfortunately, did not allow to publish us the results. But the results were very good. And I believe that TRIZ and Agile is a very, very powerful combination, potentially. And we need, in IBTA, I would propose to create a subgroup, because I already have people, my students, students, sometimes they are 70 years old. So they also are interested in that from all over the world. So let's put it into agenda to create such a subgroup, right?
Yes.
Very good. So Mike, maybe, do you have a chat window? So
yeah, let's take some questions here. So first one, how did you find the acceptance of incorporating TRIZ with Agile? Interested due to people often being only stuck on one type of tool. Yeah, so this is actually what forced me to make a change in my own thinking and my own approach. I initially using root conflict analysis, I mean, even using the causal landscape diagram initially, the solutions architects didn't understand what an object was. They didn't understand what an entity was or what an attribute was. So I actually changed the language to fit the models that they understood. So we start using the same terms: conceptual object, attribute, even functions. And so once we started to do that, and at the same time not pushing the specific solution onto the developers and the solutions architect, they were very accepting, and that's when it really started to take traction. The next one, please guide me at what kind of output each sprint will result in as input to the next sprint. Yeah, so if you think about, you'll have in that example I showed, there was probably 4 or 5 different things that we fixed. There were harmful interactions, there were insufficient interactions, there were absent interactions. So if you think about, let's just think about a screen. So let's say you're working on a mobile device, okay? And you have a user interface for the customer. In each sprint, you would try to pull off some components of that user experience for the customer. So initially you might only have maybe the first screen available to them where they can actually log in and they get a mistake proofing for a password check or something like that. But the point is that at each sprint, whatever you've created is done and it's locked away, it's been it's been tested for bugs, the bugs have been worked out, and it's closed off. Okay. Now the sprint team has to work with the executives and the other members of that sprint to prioritize what is most important to them. But ideally, that's sort of how you produce it. So I might have 2 things that get built in the first sprint, and then ideally I go to the next sprint and we build the next 2 things in that sort of user experience or user environment that we're trying to create. Next question, could we make the ideation phase so small, number of 2 weeks for sprint, but 2 minutes using Agile, so it would take less time to iterate? Yeah, that's a good question. What we need to change in terms of, that's a good question. That first sprint, that first 2-week sprint, once that's done, it's done. Normally we don't ever come back to that, but what we find is there are contradictions and opportunities for improvement within that entire landscape diagram, that causal landscape diagram. So then what we find is, in the course of 12 months, you're never revisiting that initial problem investigation, if you will. What you're actually doing is you're just doing all of your sprints to build and then to stack the build on top of each other, incorporating new systems, incorporating new features and functions.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we still have time. Maybe some more questions. Well, I just, there was a question from Richard. Did you answer it, Mike?
I did, yep. That was...
What kind of output each sprint will result in?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So it's totally dependent on the project, and it depends how many people you have in the sprint, the actual development side. And again, this doesn't have to just simply be for software development. I mean, you can still, like you were saying, Valerie, you can do this with physical products. Right. And a lot of companies now have both a product and a service, right? And so you're always kind of playing between a product and a service environment, or you at least have some customer facing aspect which deals with a transactional environment. So again, take Amazon, right? Amazon's delivering a physical product, but the customer is interacting with an application. They're entering their details and those sorts of things.
Also what I wanted to say is that when I'm asked what's the greatest value of TRIZ, usually I would like to say that we can create great ideas, but basically it wouldn't be 100% true, because the biggest value, the highest value of TRIZ is that TRIZ accelerates the process of coming up with great ideas. This is the major thing. And when we look at Agile and Scrum approaches, right, they also have the same target, to accelerate. So that's why I see this sort of organic, natural combination, the combination between 2 approaches.
And I think this, and you see this with root conflict analysis as well. Remember, in Lean Six Sigma, they go down, they're digging a hole. But when we use root conflict analysis and the causal landscape diagram, we go out. And what that allows us to do is to find contradictions, maybe 20, 30 contradictions. And because we're using if, then, and or logic, we can solve any one of those or connections, right? Or in this case, if we have and connections, chop up the and connections.
Exactly. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so Mike, we already established a future goal to reach a group with an IBTA, and done. I hope it will evolve, and you could lead it, definitely.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, and great to see you guys. Big greetings to Australia.
Thanks, Valerie.
Okay, bye-bye, Mike.